Hello, everybody, and welcome to my first review for the new Marvel series, What If? If you haven't been paying attention to the MCU shows on Disney+, the multiverse is now open for business, so to speak. The events of the first season of Loki have resulted in this brand new situation where there's timelines that can expand and go all sorts of different directions. And the end product of that is this series, What If, where we get to follow the Watcher as he peeks in on other timelines where things went a little bit differently than how they did in the main sacred timeline of the MCU. This is going to be kind of an interesting series to review because it's essentially a series of quasi non-canon one-offs. Like, they're sort of one-off specials, really. Just kind of exploring a couple different ideas. This is something that they've done in Marvel Comics before. I would assume that DC has done something similar, but Marvel literally had a series that was called, like, What If, essentially. And it would explore different versions of the characters if things went a little differently. Like, one that comes to mind, I think there was one that was like, what if Spider-Man joined the Fantastic Four and stuff like that, or maybe it was the Future Foundation, I forget. But regardless, the idea here is we're going to be looking at a series of sort of hypothetical versions of the events of the MCU had something gone differently. The presentation in this episode is the beginning almost feels a little documentary-like, but it does shift pretty quickly into a more, familiar MCU form. If my hair looks ridiculous and my face looks a little sweaty, it's because I went swimming and it is very hot up here. So we'll do the best we can. Right off the top, I can tell already without even looking at Twitter that there's going to be a whole fucking bunch of people that are upset over this episode, since every time anything involving a strong woman winds up in their spaces gets people upset. So that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun Twitter discourse. Great. Yeah. But I had a good time with this episode. Obviously, with this being an animated series, we will probably be talking a bit more about the animation and animation style than we are strict cinematography, the way we would with the live action stuff, though there is still, cinematography involved here. I would say that they did a really good job of capturing. So essentially this episode, the first episode, What If Captain Carter were the first Avenger, is sort of an alternate retelling of Captain America, the first Avenger, where the difference is that instead of Steve Rogers getting the super soldier serum, Peggy Carter does instead. Something interesting about the first Captain America movie is that a lot of the cinematography had this like slightly, part of this was probably intentional, part of it was unintentional. It had this almost uncanny sort of feel to it. Not like overly green screened, but everything felt a little bit artificial. Maybe some of it was like a bit of the heavy, like more sepia toned color grading and things like that. But there are elements where during the montages of Captain America doing his thing, there would be like a sunset or like a weird sky that feels a little bit artificial, but it adds to kind of the sort of outlandish nature of Captain America. And they play with that a bit here. They have a similar montage of Captain Carter as she goes by, kicking ass and cutting through the defenses of Hydra. And you have a lot of mirrored shots from what Captain America, the first Avenger, had. And they do the same thing with those skies. There's a lot of like sunset tones. There's a lot of these like very painterly looking sky backgrounds. And the show actually does sort of an interesting blend of 2D and 3D animation. So the bulk of the show uses, so all the characters at the very least, use a cel-shaded 3D animation technique. I don't entirely know what to compare it to. It's obviously 3D models with a cel shading, because you can sort of see some of the shadows appearing and vanishing in ways that would not really be feasible if they were being like actively drawn on. It wouldn't like make sense that they would show up that way. Not that it's a bad way, one or the other. I just mean like you can tell that it's being done kind of programmatically in that way. Meanwhile, a lot of the special effects are done in a hand-drawn 2D style. Some of them looking like they came out of an anime. Especially, there's a large explosion at the end that looks like something out of Dragon Ball Z. Like, it was kind of jarring to see it, but it does fit with the overall kind of pastiche they're going for here. And the backgrounds, for the most part, seem to be matte painted. They seem to be flat backgrounds with characters moving on top of them. There may be some that aren't. Maybe they're using painted-on textures, like very painting-like textures. But it does seem like a lot of their backgrounds are done as flat 2D paintings. It's a pretty interesting mixture. It's not jarring. I don't think there was anything like... It's not like, cartoons out of the 60s where... all the backgrounds are painted on except for the stuff that they're going to interact with, and that's going to be drawn differently, so you can tell that's the door that's going to open. But no, it's done in a very smooth way. A lot of stuff is interacted with, and it's not even noticeable that they're switching from 2 to 3D. A lot of fire effects and things are in 2D, but also fire is like incredibly difficult to render in 3 dimensions in the first place. Anyway, so overall, the animation style, I would say, is very good. Some of the rigging needs a tiny bit of work. Like, there's still sort of I'm going to say a thing that probably sounds like an insult, and I don't mean it to be, but it strikes me in some cases, a lot of the time it's fine. In some cases, it feels like a better version of the animation rigging you'd see on a show like Ruby, where most of the time in that show, everyone looks very stiff and very weird, and like mouths are strange. Here, things are better. Mouths are still a little bit weird. There are some times where people do physical motions that are a little stiff. For example, there's a point early on where Steve Rogers, still skinny, gets shot, and 2 things that are notable here happen. One, he kind of reacts like he's being shot, but nothing happens to his body. He's just kind of like, his 3D model's just like, It's like, I assume he got shot in like the torso somewhere or something, and instead it's just kind of like, no, I don't know, maybe he's in the legs, who knows. I think the idea is that he was shot in the legs, actually, based on some of the things that happen later, but it's not really presented it very clearly, and that's kind of a problem that we'll get into in a second about the pacing of this show, or at least of this episode. We'll see how the other ones go, but so one, he reacts kind of weird without visible wounds, which obviously we're not looking for like big gory effects, but someone gets shot probably helps to make it clear what's happening there. And then he also kind of falls down in a very stiff sort of way. Like he just kind of down, and like, I don't know, the flow feels a little bit weird. Most of the time, again, it is fine. They do a lot of fight choreography that feels pretty clean. They're using the world of animation really well to play with kind of the cartoon physics at play. Like, they're not going like full-on Hanna-Barbera or anything, but they can do some stuff that is exaggerated for the purpose of a cartoon in a way that does make sense in the MCU. Like, you've seen, instances where, Steve Rogers or... I guess, Tony in the Iron Man suit, like anyone who's got like superhuman strength has been able to throw people, and you watch them kind of like fly off into the background. You get kind of elements of that here, where it works both because in the universe we've established that can happen, and also because in a cartoon it does kind of make sense for someone to have that kind of a like, whoa, into a wall or into, the air or whatever. But there's also, elements like, so Peggy obviously winds up getting the serum, and you have that moment that I think we actually mentioned in our movie nights review of Captain America, that there's that moment where there's like, and you get that like super close up on their eyes, and they try to do that here, and it doesn't really work. It does feel like they're a little restrained on the intensity of some of their animations. Like, they don't really go all the way with some of the animations, and it feels kind of like safe choices being made kind of across the board here. It was a little bit of a bummer to see that. I was kind of hoping to see a little bit more intensity from the animation. The style is good. I think the execution needs a little bit of work. And They do a lot of mirroring shots. I mentioned cinematography as being a thing that's going to be less of a huge thing that I'll be covering for these, but cinematography-wise, they do a good job of doing a bunch of mirroring shots. Peggy with the eyes opening wide, like I mentioned before. When the machine opens up and she kind of steps back out, it's very similar how Steve looks when that happens in Captain America: The First Avenger. Peggy gets sidelined in a similar way to Steve from his movie, and winds up going and blowing off steam by beating up a heavy bag, and that winds up looking and feeling a lot similar to how Steve does during kind of his introduction in the Avengers, and also in the stinger to the first Avenger. That was kind of weird how they did that one twice, and they were different scenes slightly, which is odd. Peggy makes a sacrifice at the end. That's a big mirror of Steve doing the same, including with the reference to dancing on Saturday and kind of the aftermath of the confused interaction in the future with Nick Fury, as, you know, they kind of mourn the loss of the other in the same way that happened for Captain America: The First Avenger. So there's a lot of mirroring shots, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that in this series. They're going to be going for different takes on stuff, but they're going to keep kind of winking back to the familiar ground of the 24 movies that have now come out since not since the 24 movies that have come out prior to this. They even throw a couple references in there. There's one where they hop on the train, they do the train sequence on the mountain, and they all hop on there, and now it's Peggy leading the Howling Commandos instead of Steve, though Steve is there. We'll talk about that in a second. Steve is there. And they all hop on, and Bucky almost falls off the train, and like right away, Peggy grabs him, throws him back on. It's like, whew, thought I was a goner there. You almost ripped my arm off. And it's like, hey, because the arm thing. Yeah, okay, cool. I will be very intrigued to see. It's kind of difficult for me not to, at the end of this episode, be wondering, oh, well, where does this go from here? Because essentially, Steve and Peggy are fully swapped in their roles by the end of this whole thing. Or not even by the end, very early into it. You have Steve, that's there as support, and Peggy, who is on the front lines and winds up, in the future talking with Nick Fury and Hawkeye and stuff. And it's like, okay, so presumably in this timeline, there is an Avengers that has Peggy Carter instead of Steve Rogers, and everything else is probably more or less the same. However, I'm curious how Tony Stark exists in that timeline, because in this one, Peggy Carter is actually able to obtain the Tesseract much, much earlier than Steve Rogers and all of them. Actually, were they able to get the Tesseract? I'm trying to remember now. I meant to actually go look at this. I think, oh my God, do they actually get the Tesseract until like the end of the movie? Anyway, the SSR gets the Tesseract, and Howard Stark is like, I know exactly what I want to do with this, because he spent basically the rest of his life in the sacred timeline, observing the Tesseract and trying to learn how to use it and, work with that power, resulting in him developing the arc reactor, which then Tony Stark is able to miniaturize and use as the power cell for his Iron Man suits and so on and so on. But here we have Howard Stark with the Tesseract and is able to build a giant mechanized suit. And it literally looks like the Iron Man Mark I armor that Tony builds in, I think, Afghanistan, in I guess it's Golmira. Is it in Golmira? Or is he? No, he goes back for Golmira. I think he was in Afghanistan before. And he... I'm getting off track. He builds essentially the Mark I armor called the Hydra Stomper. He builds it for Steve, who now is able to pilot that essentially as his own way to contribute to the war efforts, which I thought was a really cool way of keeping Steve in there. It adds a bit of sort of sideways lore, because now we're throwing the original Iron Man suit into that, which is pretty cool. And it's not the only time they do that. I'm not positive about this, and I'll have to see. I would have to go back and look a little more carefully, but because Johann Schmidt does not have the Tesseract for the bulk of this episode, rather than being able to develop weapons, he's instead playing with metal trinkets, which I don't entirely know what that was in reference to, because we never actually see. I was expecting is he going to have the 10 rings? Is he going to have some of Odin's treasure room or like something, but no, we don't actually. I don't think we actually learn what the metal trinkets are. But he is able to eventually. So during the train heist, Steve gets, kind of blown up and the suit is captured and Steve is okay, but the Tesseract that was powering the suit is pulled out and Johann Schmidt gets it back, Red Skull, and he starts experimenting with that and is able to use it instead of powering weapons to open a wormhole, and some creature comes out that he refers to as the Champion of Hydra, and I thought about it and I was like, I wonder, and I went to look and I think the thing that comes out, the sort of final encounter of this episode is I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it's the Obelisk, which is the creature from the start of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I think it's the same thing. I'm not positive. But again, very sideways reference, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that where we're going to have a combination of, hey, here's how this timeline deviates, and then irrespective of that, it's going to have just random stuff, random shit from other places in the MCU getting thrown in for good measure. So that was kind of cool, but I'm wondering what this means for Tony Stark in this timeline, because now there's an Iron Man Mark I armor, the Hydra Stomper, and Howard has already long perfected his power source. So what does that mean that Tony is up to come 2012 when Captain Carter arrives again? So I'm very intrigued by that, but it's difficult because the idea is that these are all supposed to be separate timelines, and we're not going to be coming back to them. Presumably, there might be something where we come back to them. I would love if the finale of What If is some interdimensional timeline threat where all of these different heroes from across the timelines come together. I would have loved to see something similar happen in the live-action MCU, because why not have some fun with all these actors? But it's a big ask to go and do that. Also, Chadwick Boseman is one of the focuses of one of these episodes where I believe he becomes Star-Lord, and obviously he has passed away, so that's not really a thing that is likely to happen for obvious reasons. The pacing of this episode is a little rough. I understand that they're essentially trying to retell the bulk of a 2-hour movie in a 30-minute episode, but there are points where it feels like they really just race through plot beats. There's a point where Howard brings Peggy essentially what becomes her Captain Carter outfit, which is like already kind of like this was going to be her USO thing if like they were playing Descender on that and then they didn't. And it's like, okay, it feels a little more contrived even than in the actual movie, but sure. And then he pops up the shield and it's like, yo, okay, hang on. In the actual movie, that was your prototype, and you were building other ones. What made you suddenly go, nope, this is the one here? So it's kind of a little weird. Also, very blink and you miss it on... So I watched this episode, and it was like, okay, the SSR has the Tesseract. Howard says he has something he can do with it. And then later on, we see Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, with the Tesseract, and I was like, well, how the fuck did he get a hold of that? But I think it took me like 10 minutes of thinking about it. I'm pretty sure what happens is the Hydra Stomper is literally powered by the Tesseract, like it's just in there, and then Steve gets captured, and then Red Skull gets the Tesseract. I think that's what's going on. It was such a like passive little piece of that story that I just missed it entirely. And I'm kind of nervous that there's going to be more of that going forward in the rest of the series, that there's going to be more bits and pieces that are like, oh, and it's gone. It's like, okay, all right. So the pacing is a little bit rough. But again, I get that they're trying to do this into half an hour, but it's like, that's a lot. That's a lot that's going on there. The tone is a little bit all over. There's kind of a weird cartoony fight with this huge Hydra dude where literally he gets his leg snapped and he's like, ah, and then he gets, I think, kneed in the balls and it's like, ooh, and it's like, okay, guys, all right, weird, but okay. And like that was probably the most extreme example, but it does kind of dart around a little bit more than most of the movies do, so it's a little bit hard to get a grasp on where they're going for tone-wise. There was really good teamwork. I really liked the teamwork they built in for Peggy and Steve on the battlefield. Some really cool stuff of her using his Hydra Stomper armor as kind of a launching point for her to be able to jump around and do battle. She's able to do battle in the air because of the Hydra Stomper's like jet propulsion technology and stuff. So a lot of really cool stuff with that. I have to give them props there for sure. Wow, I am soaked right now. Holy cow. The voice work. I got to talk about the voice work here. It feels kind of off in some way. I can't entirely describe how, and I want to be clear about a couple things first. First of all, the sound-alikes are doing fine. Most of the cast here are the original actors who played these characters. The only two that I believe are new, quote unquote, one of them is Ross Marquand as Red Skull, and he's not even technically new anymore because he replaced Hugo Weaving as Red Skull in Infinity War and Endgame. He returns here as Red Skull. He's fine. It's obviously not Hugo Weaving, but it's fine. Like, it's not like a jarring kind of difference. Also, Steve Rogers is not voiced by Chris Evans. I was wondering if that was the case because he sounded a little different. We have Josh Keaton filling in for the role of Steve Rogers, skinny Steve Rogers as he's credited in here. And again, I think he does a fine job. It's noticeably not Chris Evans, but it's not like a problem. I think he did a fine job with it. I wouldn't be too worried about any of that. Interestingly, you can definitely tell which actors are used to being in a voice booth and which ones are less suited to it, because some of the voice lines just sound very weird. There's sort of and when I say tone, I mean literally like the tone of their voice sounds strange. Where like it's done up a little more like a Disney cartoon. Like there's not a lot of gravity to some of their voices. And like some of the lines they deliver where they're trying to be like, boom, put down is like a little weak. Like there's supposed to be a reversal at one point where earlier on, Peggy, who is an SSR agent and not actually like cleared for military duty, Colonel Flynn is like, you're lucky to even be in the room right now, which is like, oof, harsh. Arguably true, but still very harsh and unnecessary. And then it gets flipped around where later on Captain Carter and the Howling Commandos are discussing stuff and Colonel Flynn's there and he offers up resistance to whatever is being said, and Carter turns and is like, you're lucky to even be in the room right now. And it's like delivered with that kind of like, come on, give it a little bit more, please. Like you're kind of making a point and putting him down at the same time. Land with that a little bit more, please. Bucky sounds a little bit like, I know that he's not supposed to be nearly as dark or damaged as he is nowadays as the former Winter Soldier and now the White Wolf, but like even still he sounds a little like, wow. And it's like that wasn't even really what he was. He already seemed a little cynical and dark even as just Bucky Barnes during World War II, so that was kind of strange. Jeffrey Wright is really, really perfect for the Watcher. I'm curious if he's going to be more prominent in any of these episodes. Like obviously the point is that he's supposed to be a passive observer, but I'm curious if like for a season finale or a series finale he'll be more involved, or if he's going to show up as the voice of the Watcher. He says the Watcher, and I think the Watchers are the race that he hails from, and I want to say that like if generally speaking when it comes to someone passively watching, like I think the What If series of comic books canonically has Uatu like as the Watcher, like the main one that's just kind of observing everything. But I'll be curious to see if in some later movie, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, something if Uatu is going to show up, if Jeffrey Wright is going to voice them or whatever. But yeah, you can kind of tell which actors are comfortable, doing their lines in a booth versus which ones aren't. And it's a little bit of a bummer that it's so all over the place across the board. Neil McDonough is okay. I don't know how I feel about that. Sebastian Stan is a little rough. Haley Atwell does generally fine, but there's a little, again, some intensity is just kind of missing. And it's tough because a lot of, those classically trained actors and stuff, they're going to more feel comfortable in person around each other to bounce off each other's energy. And that's harder to do in a booth. So, props to all the voice actors out there. It's not an easy gig. I did have one cool thing that I wanted to acknowledge, and that's at one point, they are trying to shut down the wormhole that was generated by the Tesseract, which I was wondering, like, this is kind of part of the plot to the Avengers. Are we going to suddenly get Thanos or the Chitauri or something? And it doesn't do that. But we get the big tentacles, which I think is the Obelisk. And Howard Stark complains when he's trying to shut it down that, like, everything's written in German. And Captain Carter's like, what? You never learned any of that? And he mentioned essentially it's like, yeah, well, when I was spending all my time with Hedy Lamarr, we didn't go over German, which I think is like a fun little dual purpose thing here. Because one, Hedy Lamarr was gorgeous and well known for like her acting and all of, her Hollywood star kind of talent and all of that, which fits the mold of Howard Stark's kind of playboy aesthetic and attitude. But more importantly than that, Hedy Lamarr was absolutely brilliant as an engineer, and I want to say she was one of the people most instrumental in the development of wireless technology. Like, we have Wi-Fi today because of Hedy Lamarr, so it would make perfect sense for Howard Stark to be all about spending time chatting with and learning from Hedy Lamarr. I think that's such a cool little reference there. I thought that was really good. I really appreciate that they dropped that one in there because it feels so perfect of like an intersection of the two things that Howard Stark would care the most about. Last thing I want to talk about is the closing credits were a little, not like underwhelming. It's an animated series, so having like the painted art pieces as the closing credits there is fine. But after the closing credits we've had for WandaVision, for Falcon and the Winter Soldier, for Loki, it is kind of an underwhelming finish to the episode. But again, there's not anything to like hook you into the next episode. Like, there's not any cliffhanger because next time we come back next week, it's going to be a totally different story. So it does kind of make sense that they're not going to have like a boom, whoa, what's going to happen next? Because we don't get to find out. We got the whole story. So this is kind of an anthology series, really. And I generally liked it overall. I am struggling to come up with what I think is the right rating for this. I'm actually usually I decide before I even come in. It's tough. I think I'm going to give this one I'm stuck between a 5 and a 6. I think I'm going to give it a 6. I gave the opening episodes to WandaVision and Loki 7s, and it's definitely not that good. I gave Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I think I gave that one a 5, and I think it's better, but not by a ton. So I think that's where I'm going to land on this. I think I'm going to go with a 6 for What If Captain Carter were the first Avenger. I generally like the episode. I like the idea of the series. I'm looking forward to how they continue forward. It's going to be very interesting to discuss this series in new and interesting ways as episodes come out, because I feel like I would want to talk about the same stuff I'm talking about now: the animation style, the physics, the voice acting, and maybe we'll have some different things to talk about there too. And maybe some of this will factor into Doctor Strange. Who knows? But thank you guys for watching. I would love to know what you guys think of this episode. I have no idea what's coming next. I know that there's 10 episodes. We've done one. I know there's a Marvel Zombies episode. I know there's a T'Challa as Star-Lord episode. I know there's a Peter Parker as the Sorcerer Supreme episode. I think there's one with the Vision as part of like the Black Order or something. I don't remember. And I believe there's one where the Guardians of the Galaxy defend the Earth during the Avengers instead. But that's all that I know. So there's a handful that I think there's a Captain Marvel episode. I think there's a Thor episode. I think there's an Iron Man episode, and I think there might be a Black Widow episode, so that might be our 10. But either way, thank you guys very much for watching. I would love to hear what you think about the episode and the series so far. I would love to hear what you think about these reviews. I'm trying to kind of get into a better rhythm. I'm trying not to just walk through the episode itself. Sometimes you kind of just have to talk about what is going on in a scene to make your point make sense. These were all kind of off the cuff. I have some notes in front of me, but I really don't script any of this out ahead of time. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time for the next episode of What If?